Solomon was wrong when he said there's nothing new under the sun. And Christianity has embraced a false view of reality, and it's killing the church across the world. You need to be careful when you build your worldview on someone who opens up his book by saying meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless.
Heresy is a belief or theory that strongly contradicts accepted doctrines or customs, especially within a religious organization.
I do violate traditional beliefs. I don't believe just because someone thought it in the past that it actually is true.
You are listening to the Mindshift podcast. My name is Erwin McManus, and I'm here with my dad, Erwin McManus. How you doing today?
I'm doing good. It's a crazy busy week.
Crazy busy week. We've moved out of Mosaic, the official building in Hollywood. We have redirected. We have new campuses in Calabasas, South Pass, Culver City, Studio City. Very exciting times. We did a final kind of worship night at Mosaic called Only Spirit. And I thought there'd be 200 or 300 people there, but it was about like 800 or 900
people. It was amazing.
Yeah, it was amazing. But without the, like, it was beautiful. It was so special.
It was one of the most meaningful experiences I've had in Hollywood, so it's a great way to go out.
It's pretty cool. It was the worship night with baptisms attached. It was like 70 or 80 baptisms, which was so exciting. And, it was just weird to walk around the building afterwards and like office after office being empty.
I know. I walked into my, it wasn't always my office. It was my on and again, off again office. Sometimes it was the children's space and
sometimes
preschool.
Sometimes it's the preschool. And then at one point it became storage and then COVID happened and it became your office.
But it became office again right before we left.
We did, yeah.
And I went in there, it was empty. And that's when I felt a little emotional just realizing that, the era was over for us there in Hollywood. And I just started praying out loud in the room.
Yeah. And
just thanking God for all the years there and for all the people whose lives have been forever changed, and for the just thousands upon thousands of tens of thousands of people who have entrusted their life to Jesus. It's pretty extraordinary. Yeah, so it was beautiful.
So we've been diving into the scriptures, and we've been doing Q&As on the Bible, and we've been having a couple conversations around Genesis.
Yeah.
Where should we go next?
Well, I do think we need to kind of stay in Genesis for a while.
Do you think?
I do. I think we need to incubate here, and we can go to other places from there, But
okay.
I think there's still a lot more interesting things there, and it's interesting reading the comments. And whenever there's a clip, the clip is never in context. It's always just that clip. And by the way, Jacobs does a great job of pulling those clips and making it sound profoundly controversial.
Yeah.
Which I guess I am just sort of naturally anyway.
I guess, but it's interesting. People are really stuck.
Yeah.
I find it really unique, right? I think there's a core Mindshift community tribe that's been around since Battle Ready, the title before Mindshift, and then they're part of Mindshift. And I don't think the algorithm hits our community first. I think it goes, we look at the stats and it's like 60 to 80% new people, non-followers. And then even, some of yours and mine, personal stats, it was all half non-followers, which is really, really interesting because it's pretty aggressive in the comments. So if you're part of the community, just simmer.
Well, that's all right. It's okay to have comments and perspectives and different opinions. And I'm actually quite okay when people comment and they, vehemently disagree. I do think it's interesting that so many people love throwing in heretic, which
I find it really interesting. I went at some pastor on Sunday because I was like, hey man, you're a lead pastor of a church on a Sunday morning. This is what you're doing. Hey, how about get out of our comments and prep for your message? Yeah. And maybe your church would have more than 50 people.
But it's amazing. It's always the institutional powers that use the word heretic.
But it's just people.
A heretic is
What do you mean? There's just people on the comments. It's not institutional powers.
No, but it's people who have actually bought into the views of institutional powers.
Yes.
Yeah, because a heretic is a person who has a new way of thinking. It's not necessarily that you're wrong, you see. And when people say heretic, what they really mean is you're the devil.
What these people in our comments mean are you are Satan.
Yeah, you are Satan. You are the devil. You're driving the world to hell. And
heresy is a belief or theory that strongly contradicts accepted doctrines or customs, especially within a religious organization.
See, so by definition, I am a heretic, so I accept that.
Yeah.
And because I do violate traditional beliefs, I don't believe just because someone thought it in the past that it actually is true. And I don't think history is validation. Orthodoxy is not confirmation.
But you have an interesting conversation around yesterday's orthodoxy.
Yeah.
Is
today? Today's heresy.
Okay, sorry. Keep going.
Today's heresy is tomorrow's orthodoxy.
Interesting. Can you break that down for me?
Yeah, sure. It was once heretical to believe that the world was round. If you didn't believe the world was flat, you were unbiblical. Because we have a way of attributing to the Bible things it does not say, because it's what people have held to it before. It was unbiblical to believe that the earth revolved around the sun, because we know that God created humanity as the center of the universe. So of course the whole universe, the entire universe revolves around the earth. And so these were theological positions that had scientific implications, which I think is amazing. And so when you hold something in the past, it doesn't mean that it's actually rooted in truth. It's rooted in tradition. And by the way, when we're speculating and looking at different perspectives, alternative interpretations of passages, I'm really aware of the fact that I might be right and I might not be right. And I just think not being able to question things is the death of truth. And when you cannot question already held beliefs, you are no longer a seeker of the truth. You believe that you found the truth, so you're sitting on your pot of gold. And anyone who questions it and tells you maybe that's fool's gold is a fool.
Can you say it again, the last line?
No. Yeah.
Fool's gold.
You're so convinced you're sitting on your pot of gold, and so if anyone tells you, hey, that's fool's gold, they become a heretic. They become a danger to what you value, to what you possess, what you have. So the idea that John Calvin could be wrong, or Augustine could be wrong, or that some theologian in the past, whether it's John Brown or whoever it may be, John Piper, that they could be wrong, R.C. Sproul. It feels so dangerous to people to go, wait a minute, what do you mean you think they're wrong? I think they were all wrong about something, and they were probably all right about something. And that's a part of the dilemma of it, is that do you believe, so for those of you who believe the Bible, do you believe the Bible, or do you believe your preset interpretation of the Bible? They are not the same thing. And then some of the comments were people, because we did one on hell and one on, you asked me if the Bible is infallible. And by the way, I hate answering those questions yes and no, but I'm trying to respect the fact that you're wanting clear-cut answers and then an explanation, not an explanation and then a clear-cut answer.
Wait.
Yes. And because I think most of the time, yes and no questions limit our intelligence. That's why in the Senate, why in Congress, they always try to get people yes or no. Yes or no. You ever notice that? Whenever they bring someone in to, to testify before Congress, they just want a yes or no. Why? Because they don't want the truth. They want to be right.
They want the clip.
Yeah, they want the clip.
Yeah.
And so I tried to resist yes or no, but I was respecting it. And because I think the question is far more complex than, is the Bible infallible?
Okay.
Yeah.
So can we time out there?
Yes.
Can you help? Because I was talking with Tim this morning.
Okay, Tim Moore.
Yeah.
Oh, awesome.
He was great. And he was he sent me a couple of books. He was like, hey, check out these books on like the Nephilim and the Old Testament and some of like Counts of Nicaea. He was like, hey, I think you'd be interested in this.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, well, I'm curious, like, what do you disagree with? He's like, it's not that I disagree with. He's like, I've formed different theory around that theology, right? And I was like, oh, that's such a great way of saying it. And we were having like a long convo. He's on vacation on the beach, or I don't know if I'm supposed to say that, but he's on vacation. He's
working hard.
No, he sent us some photos, so he's not keeping it secret. No, but I think because he has a little more time, he's sending some feedback. And I was like, no, I think that's a great nuance there, is that, I do believe you are a theologian, but you don't come at things from a theological perspective. You come at things from a theoretical perspective. It's similar to the way Oppenheimer interacted with physics. He wasn't a mathematician. He built a team of mathematicians. He was the theorist.
Yeah,
he
just
was the
like
one who
Einstein.
could see.
He wasn't a mathematician. He was very bad at math, but he was great at theoretical physics. And so what I would say is I'm more of a theoretical physics guy.
Right.
And I'm not the guy who's necessarily the best in the world at math. But I think I'm very good at asking important questions and not allowing superficial answers to own the territory.
So with that said, how should we approach the way that we're looking at the scriptures? Because I think you have a unique way of going, what is true? And then also asking big questions about what is true.
Yeah.
And the unique nuances of the scriptures.
Right. Well, different people approach the Bible differently.
Okay.
If you don't believe in God, I would never argue with you about the Bible. If you don't believe in Jesus, I simply wouldn't argue about the Bible with you. It's just the wrong conversation. So when someone says, how can you believe the Bible? And I go, oh yeah, I understand that. It just happens that I believe in Jesus. And believing in Jesus has led me on a journey where I now completely trust the scriptures. But that was a journey. It didn't happen first. So I'm not one of those people that believed in the Bible first and then believed in Jesus. I'm one of those people who believed in Jesus, and then it took me time to believe in the Bible. And that was a really serious journey.
What was that moment? Was it that moment or that thing, that verse, that chapter that unlocked the scriptures for you?
Well, again, when I gave my life to Jesus, that moment was, I absolutely believe Jesus is God. So whatever Jesus believes, I believe. So I instantly believed in the Old Testament, Genesis through Malachi. Like, I'm in, because Jesus validates it. So you cannot be a follower of Jesus and not validate the Old Testament. In that sense, it's almost like, to be a follower of Jesus, you have to accept the Jewish Bible.
Right.
And so I dove into the Jewish Bible. I studied Hebrew in a PhD course in college, and went on with my master's degree to study Hebrew there. And I took the Hebrew seriously because Jesus did. So I wanted to know what shaped his thinking as a child. What was the context of his growth and wisdom? And then the New Testament took me a little bit longer to understand why I should accept it. I accepted the Gospels right away because they were the only source material of Jesus. And because God has given a scripture, it wasn't a hard intuitive leap to go, oh, he's going to continue doing that now. And so it was the accuracy of who Jesus is. And then from there, it was like the historical importance of Acts through the epistles of this is the story of the church that emerges. But frankly, on a very subjective level, I would read the Bible and I would have encounters with God. And so after a while, I just started in my own way going, I think God can speak to you through anything. Like he can speak to you through nature, through people, through your conscience, through experiences. But that's like taking the stairs. When you dive into the scriptures, it's like taking the elevator. And I feel like when I applied the Bible to my life, somehow it connected me deeply to the presence of God. And it began to change my mind. And that's one of the things I think was really important. I began thinking biblically. And that is probably the most significant, concrete, practical change that happened to me. I started seeing reality from a biblical worldview, which I think is really, really important. Today, I got a really important call from a friend who was working through deep issues, a business person. But they asked me, about even issues like on gender issues. And like for me, the Bible really informs me because I go, look, God created man and woman. He created us X, 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 Y. And biology and science confirms what this story actually tells us and designed us for each other. And then the scriptures, in the most poetic of way, it says that, a man will leave his father and mother and join with his wife, and they'll become one. And so, ironically, I hold a very, orthodox view of humanity because I do believe that that's central in the story, that God creates us male and female. And because they know me and they thought I would have a very, very liberal view of this, they were very surprised when I told them, no, actually, I'm inclusive and I love everyone. And I think every person has absolute access to God's grace and his love. But if you're asking me fundamentally, what do I believe about humanity as an anthropology? I believe that healthy human beings are male and female, and that's where we get our core sexual identity. And but if we could kind of leap just a little bit forward right after the fall, and because
I have one more question before we go in there.
No, of course.
So we did another little Q&A on our socials. I don't even know if I told you that we were doing it, but on Sunday I posted another thing from Mindshift. Okay. But I thought a great question that would kind of like a zoomed out perspective on how to view the Old Testament. So Bree asked how to keep a healthy / loving view of God in the brutal books in Old Testament. And the example is Judges.
Yeah, it's so such an important question, and it's so difficult.
And I think a big question that a lot of people would ask, or a common question a lot of people would ask, would be, why is God so angry?
Yeah.
And why is God a God of judgment? And why is God a God of war? And why is God condone slavery and these different genocide, these different annihilations of other tribes?
Yes.
Can you give us a way to see and view the Old Testament?
Yeah, I think that to understand the Old Testament is to understand movies like Braveheart and Gladiator and Band of Brothers. If you just take any section of those movies, they might just be seen as movies filled with violence. They're only movies about war. But once you understand the narrative in Braveheart, you understand it's a love story. You also understand that it's a commoner's journey to develop a noble capacity by going to Rome, coming back to set his people free. And so then you realize, there's certain moments in the story that carry the theme of the story. The theme of the story isn't all the battles. The theme of the story is a fight for freedom. When you look at the film, Gladiator, you could go, this is an incredibly violent story. It's just, it's gladiators and violence and murder and it's ruthlessness. But the theme is actually the battle between honor and dishonor. It's the battle between someone who is not of status but is noble and someone who's born of nobility but is lacking nobility. And so there's a powerful narrative and there's a love story in it as well. Band of Brothers is what happens in community when you're facing tremendous violence and how you band together and fight for each other for a common cause. And when we look at the Old Testament, because we're Westerners, most of us, we're raised with a Western mind, we want to dissect every line and every word as if it's supposed to be exegeted literally line by line, rather than these are stories and within these stories, principles and truths are carried. And so people say, why was there so much war in the Old Testament? I said, because it was written in real human history. Because human history has always had wars. It's just the whole idea of slavery. Wait a minute, why does the Bible actually, talk about slavery? Well, it's because all of human history has had slavery. But here's the powerful thing in the Bible. Because people think, Christianity, it's the dominant religion, right? So the Bible is the book of the dominant. It's the book of the oppressor. It's the book of the owner. No, the Bible is the book of the slave. The Bible is the book of the downcast.
The Old Testament is.
The whole Bible, because the Roman Empire was the conquerors of Israel when Jesus lived.
Right.
So Jesus was technically born into slavery. And I remember I wrote that in one of my books, and the publisher tried to take that out because they wanted to be politically correct. And I said, no, Jesus was born into slavery, into oppression. The Jews were dominated by the Romans. They did not have freedom. And, the level of, quote, freedom your oppressor gives you doesn't make you free.
Right.
And so from Genesis to Revelation, the Bible is written by people who knew oppression, who lived in slavery, and who longed for freedom. And that, for me, is the more important theme. Why is there so much violence in the Bible? Because they were constantly oppressed, because they were always fighting for their freedom, because that was the human story, because every tribe, whether it was the Canaanites or the Philistines or the Moabites, believed that they were on a mission from their gods to conquer everyone else. And the hostility, the level of violence in there is much more deeper than we know. Because, when you look at the Moabites who sacrificed babies to their gods, and the reason God would say do not intermarry wasn't racial, it was spiritual, because he did not want them to embrace their gods
and their practices.
And so when you're looking at that dynamic, there's so much more going on than we understand. So what I want us to realize is there are wars in the Bible because human history is a history of war. And God met us in real time, in the real space. There is no place in history God could have interacted with us without wars.
I love it. Okay. With that said, you said you want to go back to Genesis.
And have a little fun here, right? Because one of the things that for me was always challenging was whenever I would ask questions about the Bible and people would say, oh, yeah, no, we don't know. Or they give me an answer and it was so obviously fake, and because you have Adam and Eve, and then you have Abel and Cain, or Cain and Abel. And then, of course, Cain kills his brother, but they have wives, and then when Cain's being cast out, he says to God, and I don't have my scriptures in front of me, but we can always pull it out the next session. And if people come back with questions, if you send me out to these other cities, they're all going to want to kill me. And, my obvious question when I was a brand new follower of Jesus was where do all the people come from, right? Wait a minute, because we do a genealogy and we go back historically and go, you see, the human history is 4,000 years old. And it's because we go Abel and Cain, and then, Adam and Eve, Abel and Cain, and then everybody else.
Right.
And wait a minute, there's a massive history of human civilization that we completely ignore and we don't answer the question to. And a part of the reason is because our orthodox views of the Bible do not contain enough room for the biblical truths. We ignore what the Bible says so that it fits into what we believe the Bible says. And so you do not have an adequate understanding of Genesis until you can explain where all those people came from.
I cannot. But I would like to talk about heresy. I know we want to talk about Genesis, and this is going to be a shorter app out of a few of them. But people on YouTube have asked for longer episodes. They said, can you please pull the 40-minute to an hour length time that you guys stick to? Can you guys just
so you can run on your Peloton or at the gym?
I don't know. That's a long run. That's longer than I'm running on the Peloton. But maybe we could sit and do some longer form conversations where maybe we.
This is going to turn into what Letters was.
Which we should talk about Letters. Yeah. I mean, when I was living in New York, I was 22, and you were doing these long form 6-hour sessions on Saturdays
on a book of the Bible
in Hollywood. And you would just open the doors. You'd have 2 big whiteboards. You'd have someone helping you who would essentially, and you'd have 2 mics in the middle of the room, in the aisles, and people would just come up for the first 30 minutes to an hour and just ask questions.
Yeah.
And you would announce what book you're talking about, so people would prep their questions, and you would just someone would write up questions on the whiteboard. And sometimes you'd stack the questions. Sometimes you just hit the question right there and just address the question and start answering it. And then you take a 30-minute lunch break and you go on for another couple hours. But
so you had a question about heresy.
Maybe we should do Letters as a part of the pod.
Maybe.
A long form open thing we do in a different city or something. I don't know. Okay, heresy. You spoke at a conference in 2009 or 8.
Oh, wow.
Called Catalyst. And you talked about, one of your opening lines was Solomon was wrong.
Yes, I said Solomon was wrong. And 20,000 people went silent.
I'm asking the question. I'm setting the stage. You said Solomon was wrong. That he had written that there was nothing new under the sun.
Yes.
And that you had addressed that verse. Why did you feel the need to talk about it? Okay. But I would like to set the stage up a little bit even more.
Sure.
Because 10 years later, maybe 12, you speak at Catalyst again, and we're sitting in the opening session, and Andy Stanley's sitting there, or speaking. He's opening up the session. He says, "We all know that Solomon was wrong." And
the whole place cheered.
And I do think it was an ode to the time you had spoken and said Solomon is wrong, and we walked out of there, and I thought we were literally going to get lynched.
Yeah.
By
I was blacklisted from Catalyst for the next decade.
which, thank God, was
Yeah.
the worst. But but you ended up doing an interview after that second session, where you referred back to the 10 years before, where you said Solomon was wrong, and you pointed it out. You said, "Can you believe that 10 years later we know things to be true that we didn't know 10 years ago?"
Yeah.
And so, can you walk me through those moments in your life? Because you were deemed a heretic for 10 years, probably.
Yes.
Maybe your whole life, but
Yeah.
for 10 years of
Pretty much
your
my whole
pastoral career and being a speaker, in a Western world, you were blacklisted. So it was really unique.
Yeah, there's so much into that particular message, because I remember I was speaking at the Global Leadership Summit with, I don't know, 150,000 people listening, and I'm shaking, I'm like jittering, and Kim's like, "Why are you so nervous? Why are you so nervous?" It's because I felt in my soul that God was instructing me to not do my talk on my book, Chasing Daylight, which would have sold a lot of books, but to bring back that message that Solomon was wrong. And
Where is this in the context of Catalyst? This GLS?
Years later, like 8 years later.
So Catalyst happens, you speak that message, and then
I disappear from Christianity for a long time.
You took
for
like
6 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for public, and then I come back, and Willow Creek invites me, and then I'm hearing this inner voice saying, "You need to bring this back."
What year do you think this was?
I don't even remember. Maybe 2015 to 14, somewhere there. Okay. And Kim's like, "Oh, why?" And I remember when I got there and I said that, Bill Hybels just put his head down and didn't look up.
Yeah.
And then when I was finished speaking, he literally just got up there and said, "Well, guys, conference is over. Bye." And it was like just a thundering, thud of an end. What was happening was I came to faith, and by the age of 29, I was being hired as a futurist and working with denominations, organizations, universities, and I started traveling the world. And everywhere I went, people would quote Solomon and say to me, Erwin, there's nothing new under the sun." And it was like a theological patting on my head, because I'm 30 years old, and they're saying, "Erwin, there's nothing new under the sun." I probably heard that phrase everywhere I went in the world where I met Christian leaders. And at first I didn't really have a response, but it was just eating at me, because I could see how it was destroying the intellectual capacity of Christianity. Honestly, that theological position may have dumbed down modern Christianity more than any belief system. And so it wasn't just about this statement, it was what it was doing to our mental capacity. Because once you believe there's nothing new under the sun, you shut the door to innovation, creativity, imagination, and the creative process. And one day I remember we were living in Whittier. I was in the living room, and I said to your mom, "I can't take it anymore." I said, "Solomon was wrong when he said there's nothing new under the sun." And Kim said to me, literally, she looked at me, she goes, "You are going to hell."
Mom said that to you,
Yes.
And she meant it. If she says it, she means it.
Yeah, and I said, Solomon was wrong, and Christianity has embraced a false view of reality, and it's killing the church across the world. And so it wasn't that I needed to be right. I felt it was a virus that was stealing the future from the church. And she begged me, she said, "Please never say that outside of this room." So I held it for 10 years probably. And then when Catalyst happened, I just couldn't keep it inside anymore, because I love the book of Ecclesiastes. It's probably a book I've studied more than almost any book. And in fact, I waited 20 years to teach Ecclesiastes because I was so afraid to not do it justice. And so I got up there and said, Solomon was wrong when he said there's nothing new under the sun. You need to be careful when you build your worldview on someone who opens up his book by saying meaningless, everything is meaningless. When someone has embraced nihilism, when someone has embraced this level of apathy and despair, you want to build your worldview on how they see reality. And so I created a contrast. I said, you either believe Solomon when he says there's nothing new under the sun, or you believe God. Because in Isaiah 43, 18 and 19, he says, put away the former things. Do not dwell in the past. Behold, I am doing a new thing. Even now it springs up, but will you even be aware of it? So ironically, there are verses all over the Bible where God says, I'm doing something new. But those verses didn't shape our worldview as much as there's nothing new under the sun. And so the way I try to explain this is, you're right. There's nothing new under the sun when you're part of the created order. You're trapped. But when you're part of the creative order, everything becomes new. In fact, God says, behold, I'm doing a new thing. And then look at the consistency of the pattern. I'm going to give you a new song. I'm bringing a new covenant. I'm going to give you a new heart. I'm going to give you a new mind. I'm going to give you a new spirit. Oh, by the way, and I make all things new. And, my mercies are new every morning. Oh, if you are in Christ, you are a new creation. How is it possible that this theme throughout the scriptures, that God makes all things new, that everything becomes new with God, got buried under this nihilistic view of reality that there's nothing new under the sun? And when I said that, I was branded a heretic because it had been accepted historically. Orthodoxy was that there was nothing new under the sun. I can say I've gotten to see a few things in my lifetime where when I taught it, it was seen as heresy, and now it's seen as biblical theology, and that's one of them.
It was a cool moment to be a part of, because the first one, not so fun to be a part of.
No.
And you were mad that day.
I did, and I walked off that stage and I said, I'm done.
You didn't even pray at the end, which that was tough. And then you just literally good night. And then you walked up the stage and you're like, let's go. And I'm sitting in the front and I'm like, now there's 20,000 people mad at us. So who knows if we're going to make it to the car. It's going to be a 28 years later scene. And it was palpable. The anger and the discomfort and the frustration from the room. It was. I've met people since who were in that room. We have lots of friends who were in that room that day that we didn't know, but now we do, who remember that moment.
Yeah.
And then to come back 10 or 12 years later and to hear Andy Stanley say that, and he's a good...
I love Andy.
He's an amazing human being, but he's also a friend of yours. And then to have him, it felt like a nod. And maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was just us reading into the moment.
Or maybe it was just God bringing it full circle for us.
Yeah, but it was his opening line of the conference.
It opened it up with that.
And it was so special.
And by the way, just on a personal level, I prayed and I said, God, why would you want me to say this? No, I'm going to be hated. And I feel like I heard God speak to me and say, I don't care if people like you. I care if you tell people what they need to hear. And so I had to make a decision in my life. I'm going to live my life for where the church might be 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now, not how I'm embraced by the church in the moment. And because if someone doesn't tell the truth, we're all going to just keep believing lies. And it was never true that there's nothing new under the sun. Never true. I don't care what theologian wrote it, what theologian believed it, or what theologian believes it. It has never been true that there's nothing new under the sun. Solomon was wrong. And by the way, a lot of people in the Bible are wrong. Because God doesn't just let the people who are right get recorded in the Bible.
Can you give me another example?
Judas was wrong.
Okay.
Peter, when he cut off the guy's ear, was wrong.
Okay. I like that moment. That's one of my favorite moments of the scripture.
I know it's inspired you.
I love
model
it.
For life.
I'm like, he cut the ear off. He's still good. He's still good. We're good. We're going to be okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's so unique. I would love to do an episode where we just highlight moments like that. Just because the moments where you go, okay, if you read the book of Ecclesiastes,
yes,
Solomon is having a bad moment, right? He's talking about the weight of knowledge, the weight of wisdom, that with great knowledge comes great grief.
Yeah. He says that humans and animals are the same. We all die and go to dust.
So unique.
We don't accept that.
We don't, right? Yeah, that's so interesting.
And,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's so many things in the book of Ecclesiastes that we know aren't actually the right perspective on life.
So do you think it's the way we look at the scriptures versus
Yes,
what we glean from
well,
them?
what it is the Bible becomes an ink blot for us. The church has been run on an adopter categorization of change. The church has been run by late adopters, nostalgics, laggards, traditionalists.
Okay, break down the adoptive language.
Okay, there's a natural sociological grid. It's like a bell curve, and it tells you where people fall on the rate of change, pace of change, adaptability to change. Only about 2% of people are innovators. About 12% are called early adopters. About 34% are early majority, 34% late majority, about 12.4% late adopters, and about 2.2% are what are called laggards. We call them nostalgics. Historically, the church has been led by laggards and late adopters. Our theology has been shaped by laggards and late adopters. Innovators and early adopters have almost had zero impact on the theological construct of Christianity in the modern world. It was in the beginning because it was Jesus who is the consummate innovator.
But okay, so there's so many questions I have about this, but I think
Paul was also an innovator.
that's what I was going to ask. What other New Testament figures?
Jesus and Paul were innovators, and then very, very quickly, the moment the church became institutionalized, the moment the Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church solidified, it began to be led by laggards and late adopters. So theology was skewed by that framework, which is why there was such an easy belief that there's nothing new under the sun. That concrete, linear, didactic way of thinking dominated the church. It's also why we have 2,000 years later the same conversation of when Jesus said, if you eat my flesh and drink my blood, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you can have no part of me. Why did it become literal? Because laggards, nostalgics, late adopters, people who are more concrete and literal in their way of thinking, took that verse and couldn't imagine Jesus using it as a metaphor, which it was clearly a metaphor.
What was the metaphor?
That unless you embrace my death as your way to life, you can have no part of me.
That we turned into communion.
And we turn into, it's got to be the literal body and the literal blood of Jesus. Why? Because it's a certain mental construct that takes the Bible and dominates the theological conversation. It doesn't really require that much intuition to go when Jesus says, I'm the living bread, that they're looking at bread, which in the Arabic, the word for life and bread is the same. So he's making a parallel. I'm the living water because he's standing next to a well. These are clearly intuitive metaphors. So when Jesus says to them, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you can have no part of me. He's still alive. He's still physically there. He's clearly giving them a metaphor. But the church theology has been driven by concrete, linear thinkers. So I'm being pretty intense on this.
No, I know. I want to ask one last question before we wrap up.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're talking about how to view the scriptures, how to look at the Old Testament.
Yeah.
What's a healthy way for us to hang on to the truths, just to learn the truths, but then also keep a loose grip on what God is trying to teach us about the scriptures and reveal to us in the scriptures?
Yeah. For me,
is that a fair question?
Yeah. The central principle is this: do not interpret Jesus through the Bible. Interpret the Bible through Jesus. Start with Jesus. Know who he is. He's the one who died for us. He's the one that rose from the dead. He's the one that gives you life. So start with the Gospels, understand who Jesus is, and then allow Jesus to inform you in interpreting the entire Bible. Mm-hmm. And if you do that, you have a better chance of not misinterpreting the Bible.
I love it.
Yeah.
This is a quicker episode.
All right.
We just want to wrap it up. Hey, if you're listening to this, thank you guys so much.
I guess next week
we'll go longer.
I'll tell you where the people came from.
Yes.
In Genesis 4.
Will you?
I will.
Okay.
I'm going to answer that question.
I'm very excited.
And then if we get to 5, I'm going to tell you who the Nephilim are.
Join us on the Mindshift podcast community. Hit the link in the bio, mindshiftpod.com. You can join the community today. We have a group on school. We do a live once a month conversation. Tomorrow we're going to talk about politics and immigration, ICE, all the things going on in Iran. This is, when you listen to this podcast, this will have happened a couple of days ago, but you can access all of these private episodes on Mindshift Pod community. Rate and review this episode. Subscribe to the YouTube. We will see you guys next week. Thank you guys so much.
All right.
Thanks, Dad.
Have a great week. Love you.